Hey there, are you playing Brewmaster yet? Wait, have you not realized that you can cheese raid bosses and tank multiple trash bags without dying because of stagger? Wait, did you not know that Brewmaster can actually bypass certain mechanics because they're so strong? We're gonna have you reroll to Brewmaster. Don't worry, everything's gonna be fine, just start leveling your Brewmaster, it's gonna be okay. Hello guys and welcome to my new video, and today we'll be talking about the best tank specs in BfA patch 8.2.5, and we'll also look at patch 8.3 changes that are proposed by Blizzard. Keep in mind, like disclaimer to all of these videos, we're looking at high-end Mythic rating, we're looking at high-end Mythic Plus content. 8.3 changes are not finalized yet, there might be some nerfs and buffs. And again, we're looking at really high-end Mythic rating and Mythic Plus. A lot of the times at lower end, certain other tanking specs might be more suitable, but at really high-end content, we're gonna have to look at some of the tanking balance. So let's get started with raid tank performance for BfA patch 8.2.5. And just like the intro said, there is really one tank spec that has been dominating tanking balance for as long as I remember. Their special utility has made them one of the strongest mythic progression tanks, especially when everyone's undergeared, and that is Brewmaster Monk. Brewmaster Monk, without a doubt, is head and shoulders above every other tank in terms of mythic early progression. The stagger ability just works so well for groups that are undergeared, that are looking to push mythic end content. For a lot of instances, an undergeared Brewmaster tank might be able to survive bigger hits than a geared other tank. And Brewmaster has made its name in terms of, hey, we can duo tank as Brewmasters instead of having 3 tanks. Hey, we can solo tank this with a Brewmaster. Hey, we can bypass this mechanic with just a Brewmaster. And every other tank is left in the dust when you compare it to what Brewmaster is able to achieve. All of a sudden, not only their damage mitigation, their survivability is insane, also their DPS is actually quite good with certain different talents and certain different essences that came out. All of a sudden, Brewmaster is just dominating everything, and I could just end my video right now, and it'll be a good representation of what tanking balance is right now in BfA, especially when it's coming to raiding. If you're a mythic raider who's looking to progress high-end content, you probably have been asked, or you probably have an alt Brewmaster looking to gear them up for the next raid. And I won't blame you for this. Not only they have a lot of utility, high mobility, they also provide the 5% physical buff that is contributed by being a monk, and considering that Mistweaver and Windwalker has been pretty poor in high-end mythic raiding progression for BfA, Brewmaster might be the only monk in your raid group if you're looking to optimize or have an optimal raid setup for a lot of these high-end mythic raid bosses. So all of a sudden, Brewmaster is not only mandatory, but it's also one of the best tanks. If I want to talk about second best or third best or fourth best tank in raiding, it's really hard for me to determine that, because if I'm looking through the logs of world first kills, it's mainly all Brewmasters. All of these top guilds like Method Limit, they used 1 or 2 Brewmasters for majority of the fights. And all of a sudden, what is the best second tank? Brewmaster is so far ahead that I'm gonna say that the second best slot is gonna be occupied by 3 tanking specs, and they are Protection Warrior, Blood Death Knight, and Prot Paladin. Now, the reason why I placed all of these tanks in this spot, because first of all, their representation in these mythic raids is quite high. By a lot of standards, if you look at the number of passes, you'll see that Prot Warrior, Blood Decay, Prot Paladin, they're all highly represented in a lot of this content. I could mention that Prot Warrior might be considered as the second best progression tank, because if you look at some of these world first kills, there were quite a few guilds who did use a Prot Warrior, because Prot Warrior physical mitigation is still very strong. The damage has been nerfed, which is not that big of an impact in raids, but it is bigger in Mythic Plus, and we'll talk about Mythic Plus later on. But overall, Prot Warrior has really strong mitigation, especially when dealing with physical damage. And they have been chosen by a lot of mythic guilds in a lot of these mythic first kills. But you can't argue the fact that Blood DKs and Prot Paladins have a very strong niche when it's needed. Blood Decay is very popular for fights like Mythic Ashara, because Death Grip or Mass Grip is extremely strong to dealing with the adds. So all of a sudden, Blood Death Knight might be one of the best tanks because you need that utility. To the same extent, Prot Paladin can fit the same role, if you need spell warding. Spell warding is actually insanely strong depending on the situation. It was used by a lot of other guilds when dealing with certain bosses that had this magic debuff that required, like, you know, stacking or moving out, or maybe even suiciding the person who got this magic debuff. But instead you could bring a prot paladin and they'll apply spell warding on them and everything will be fine. So if the new raid is gonna have these certain mechanics, prot paladin could have a very strong niche if the boss allows for it. So even though Blood Death has received quite a few nerfs in the past couple of patches, their armor has been reduced, they still have a spot in raids depending on, you know, depending if you need that mass grip. Same with prot paladins, if you need that spell warding or if you need that constant interrupts, prot paladins are great with that as well. They also have a choice of picking extra mitigation or extra DPS if they can allow for it. A lot of the tanks generally go with, you know, Crucible of Flame for a single target, and certain tanks do have Conflict of Strife, which allows them to do more DPS, but that's only for certain tanks. And Vision of Perfection has become a very strong essence for certain tanks to increase their mitigation, and we'll talk about that. So the third spot is going to go to tanks that are least represented, and that is Vengeance, Demon Hunter, and Guardian Druid. Now they have a low representation, and I don't feel they're as bad as people say. Vengeance, all of a sudden, I've been raiding with the Vengeance Demon Hunter, and their survivability is quite strong, especially if you try to prolong your metamorphosis with things like Vision of Perfection and certain talents. All of a sudden, the meta uptime is quite high and your survivability is really good. Guardian Druid, to some extent, has certain utility like Stampeding Roar, which can be very strong. But a lot of the times, these two tanks, they are perfectly viable, but other tanking specs have something more to offer, especially when you consider that every tank is trailing behind Brewmaster. The gap between Brewmaster and every other tank in Mythic rating is absolutely insane at this given point. And that's why Blizzard has nerfed Brewmasters coming into patch 8.3, mainly with stagger, stamina, but they're also fixing the bug with Gift of the Ox, which kinda gave them more healing spheres and more self-sustain, and that is going to be fixed. There's going to be nerfs. My initial prediction is that, hey, maybe Brewmaster is not going to be the best Mythic Plus tank, which we'll cover later on. Maybe you won't need Ring of Peace in the new Mythic Plus affix, but Brewmaster is still going to be one of the best early Mythic progression tanks because Stagger is still there. As long as Stagger is part of Brewmaster class fantasy, Brewmasters are still going to be those, you know, undergeared, taking biggest hits and surviving. And that just works so well for that early Mythic progression. Now, if you look at Mythic Plus, especially in 15 and up, the balance isn't too bad. I feel in lower end keys, you can play any tank and you can succeed pretty well. There isn't a huge tank disparity when you're doing like 15 and up. And you can see that from this chart where most of the tanks are doing pretty well. Again, the community perception of Guardian Druids and Vengeance Demon Hunters is a little bit lower, so I guess player base for them is somewhat unrepresented. But if we actually go to 20 and up keys, you start noticing that there is a big disparity, and Brewmaster all of a sudden became not only the best raiding tank, but also the best Mythic Plus tank because of how strong they are. All of a sudden, Prot Warrior, who was very, very highly regarded in the previous patches, has kind of dipped down to that second spot. So you can mainly say that it's Brewmaster Monk, you can say that Prot Warrior is probably second, and then maybe Prot Paladin third. And then after that, you have the underperforming specs or undervalued specs in terms of Guardian Druid, in terms of Vengeance Demon Hunter, and Blood Decay has really, really fallen down in Mythic Plus because I feel the nerfs that happened to them to do with their armor value and things like that was too much. So basically, the survivability of a DK is in the Blood Decay player's hands because their death strikes and their survivability is gonna carry more weight than a healer being able to heal up from 10% to full, which is going to be very rare. So all of a sudden, as a DK, you have to be very careful about which mobs you're gonna pull, how are you going to do your sustain, are you able to hit the mobs, and things like that. I feel they do need a certain buff to their survivability in order to have high representation in these high plus 20 keys, because in high plus 20 keys, Blood Decay has really, really dropped down, and it's all about that Brewmaster Monk who can do a lot of DPS with their Conflict and Strife Major. They have a lot of self-sustain. Again, that's gonna get nerfed in 8.3, so my prediction is that Prot Warrior is gonna become, or at least there is a chance that Prot Warrior is gonna become the most popular tank again, because again, Vision of Perfection is getting a slight buff. Vision of Perfection is very good for a Prot Warrior in these high keys. At the same time, spell reflect is very strong for a prot warrior as well. So all of a sudden, Mythic Plus balance might change. There's a new affix. Ring of Peace for Brewmaster might not be as strong anymore. So all of a sudden, there is a spot for that new tank in that Mythic Plus pushing meta. But overall in this video, there is a very strong disparity in raiding scenarios in terms of what tank is the best. I feel Brewmaster is still going to be very, very strong. In Mythic Plus, I feel there's going to be fluctuations between which tanks are going to be strong. I would love to know your opinion about this. I would love to know your opinions about the tanking meta in raids. Do you feel that Brewmaster should be dominating Mythic raiding scene as much as it has in the past few expansions? Do you like the Mythic Plus meta that's emerging? And how do you feel about the new Mythic Plus affix? Let me know, guys, and again, if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe. It really helps out the channel. It helps me to put out more videos like this, and I'll see you in my next guide.